Second Timothy chapter 4, and please excuse my voice. We were working our way through. This is kind of Paul's concluding remarks. In verse 13, after some instruction here, he goes, "When you come, bring the cloak I left with Carpus at Troas and my scrolls, especially the parchments." We don't know. This is the only time Carpus appears in the Bible. But we do know about Troas. Paul writes in, I think it's in 2 Corinthians, that God opened a door of opportunity in Troas. So he preached the gospel there. That was one of his launching points for a missionary voyage. It was also, this is in Acts chapter 20. Paul comes back to Troas and he preaches all night. I know we all think probably, with rare exception, man, our preacher just goes and goes and goes. Well, you know what? Paul went all night. And it was in a second story room. The room was full of people. If you've ever been in a room with hard walls, hard ceiling, hard floor, packed with people, that's a lot of human body heat generated and radiated. A few lamps, all right, add the smoke of oil lamps, and Paul going on and on and on and on. Although, let's be honest, if you get a chance to listen to Paul talk, and he talks all night, you're going to be good with it. Well, there was a guy named Eutychus, a young man, we don't know his age, but he was a young man, who was sitting in the window. A pretty smart place to sit when the room is packed that full. But as the night went on, he fell asleep. And as his body relaxed, he tumbled out of the window down to the ground to his death. Paul rushes out and he raises Eutychus from the dead. My dad told me the way to remember Eutychus's name. If you had fallen out of a window, Eutychus too, right? Eutychus. Well, evidently, Paul had been there long enough and was in relationship with a guy named Carpus in Troas, and he had left some of his stuff, a cloak and scrolls with parchments. Now, all of what I'm going to say is purely conjecture. It's my own imagination at work, but that's probably okay to think in these terms. Why would Paul want Timothy to bring him his cloak? I mean, he was imprisoned. Maybe the prison was so dank and wet and cold in the belly of the prison, because that's where he would have been. Maybe he just need another covering of some kind. Or else he was hopeful that he would be going elsewhere. And if he went elsewhere, he would need his cloak. I don't know. For the romance of it, I like the idea that he was looking forward to going somewhere else and needing his cloak for the journey. I see Paul as a realistic person, but pretty much always hopeful. Although there's one big gap in my story here, and it's the fact that Paul says earlier in this same chapter, he says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. As though he knows the end is here. So maybe forget about all that sentimentality of, oh, he's got one more place he wants to go. I think it's probably because just the comfort. Just the comfort. Okay. But he says the scrolls, and especially the parchments. There were books, but not, mainly there were scrolls. And we all know what a scroll is, but we probably, not very many of us, have seen what would have been a biblical scroll, a scroll from century 1. There were principally two kinds of material used to build scrolls. The most common of all was papyrus. There are actually still scrolls from the 2nd century and 3rd century made of papyrus that have been preserved. Papyrus, don't mistake papyrus for paper, because it's not the same thing. Papyrus is it's almost paper, but it's paper on steroids. It is very strong. When Debbie and I got to go to Egypt, to Cairo, our friend James took us to a papyrus studio where they have just hundreds of papyrus with artwork on them, and many of them dating back to antiquity. But it was demonstrated to us how papyrus is made. And then when you hold papyrus, it's way more durable than cloth, absolutely more durable than even cardboard, flexible. It's a unique, very utilitarian kind of thing. But it had its limitations. And the way a scroll was made is you would connect piece after piece after piece after piece, and then you roll it up, and when you want to read it, you unroll it. Well, that's how most documents were made and preserved. And Paul had scrolls. And here's another thing about scrolls. Don't be misled, or misunderstand rather, the availability of written materials. You can find a used bookstore and pick up a book for $1 or $2, right? If you buy them new these days, they're $22 or $25, hardbound. Well, and they're available. You're 3 or 4 clicks away from being able to order it and have it there the next day, right, at your doorstep. That wasn't the way it was in the 1st century. Gutenberg didn't invent the printing press until the 1600s, wasn't it? Or maybe it was the 1500s. Anyway, many centuries after Paul. And so any written document was handwritten, copied by scribes, who, you didn't just decide you're going to be a scribe and then start copying things. You had to prove your ability, your reliability. And there was virtually no margin for error in your copying. They were human copy machines. It's most likely that these scrolls that Paul owned and wanted brought to him were written in Greek. And so, because Greek was the universal language in the first century, which is interesting because the Roman Empire had taken what Alexander the Great had began as he expanded the Grecian kingdom, or called the Greco kingdom, and Rome now ruled the world. I mean, literally the known world. You would think Latin would be the universal language, but it was Greek. Okay, well, whatever. Anyway, I come back to the point. Common people rarely would have had scrolls because they had to be hand copied, and if they were of any length, it would have been expensive to have them hand copied or to buy them after they had been hand copied. I don't think Paul was a man of means. By no means. He was king of the road, however. You got to be old to understand that reference. But anyway, he had times, according to what he wrote in Philippians, he said, I know what it's like to have plenty, and I know what it's like to have nothing. Well, I'm thinking that in those times of plenty, he acquired scrolls. Two kinds. Run it back, Steve. One was papyrus. The other was parchment. Now, parchment is animal skins that had been cured, and then the curing process was not very different from what curing is now, but mainly I'm given to understand that these parchments were goat and sheepskin because they were most plentiful, possibly deer skin as well, but not the thick skin of, for instance, cattle. Well, anyway, they were more durable than the papyrus, and because of that, they were more expensive. And so I think what Paul would have done, the reason I think he said especially the parchment, is because that was the most important literature to him and for him, and he wanted that. Now, what's the use of me going into all this? Well, first of all, it's there, and secondly, I think you can't let yourself forget that Paul was a man who never wanted to stop learning. He was a student of God, a student of grace, a student of life and of people. We don't know what the contents of these scrolls were, but we do know they were important enough to him. He wanted them, knowing he was in the last of his life. For a bibliophile like myself, I think that's kind of cool. I love my books. Most of them are on my iPad now through Kindle, but I love my books, and I think Paul did too. All right. I gave you really nothing to work on life with today. That's the way it goes. I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.